Historical knowledge is disseminated through textbooks, historians' essays, memoirs, official documents, and a variety of other texts and documents. When studying a particular topic or event, the history student must create a mental representation for multiple sources of information. History involves the construction and interpretation of past events, and our knowledge of most history topics entails some degree of uncertainty and controversy. As a consequence, many historical accounts are tainted with incompleteness, inconsistencies, or bias. Thus, learning history includes the ability to integrate, to complete, and to challenge the knowledge conveyed through multiple historical sources. An historian has mastered these abilities through years of academic training, historical research, and peer-reviewed writing. So how can a student of history gain these abilities and overcome the challenges of the profession? How does one study history? Where does one begin in exploring the historical processes? The answer to these questions and so much more are provided when we open up the Historian's Toolbox. Opening up the Historian's Toolbox requires a key, and that key is defining what history is. Understanding history as a form of study requires a differentiation between what is the past and what is history. The past is simply a reference to a time before the present. On the other hand, history is an attempt as a society to research, analyze, study, and explain the past. History allows for an understanding, or at least a variety of explanations, as to why people behave in a certain way in relation to their circumstances. Therefore, history is a study of how things change, what influences and factors cause these changes, and how society perseveres despite these changes over time. A student of history cannot begin their journey into the past without the first tool in the toolbox, and that tool is historiography. Historiography is the relationship between a subject and how the history of that subject has been written about. As we move forward in the discourse of recorded time, history itself becomes fluid. Historians often include personal knowledge, experience, and biases in their work, and therefore interpretations of history can change based on a multitude of causal factors. The historical subject's events are not the focus in historiography, but instead becomes the identifying of how the subject is written about throughout the past. Analyzing changes in schools of thought that have taken place over a given time frame becomes the goal in historiography. Historians utilize historiography when analyzing their research on a given topic. It provides details that can prove or disprove a theory or argument for narrative work. Historiography can also explain why a subject has been viewed differently over time and how that change has affected the present. History provides an almost unlimited number of choices when analyzing topics to research. An historian will usually be a type-specific historian, but will further investigate, research, and analyze sources from within the processes of a multitude of history types identified. Part of the historical process for any student will be to identify the type of history one plans to pursue in their research and analysis. A subcategory of history type is the history field. In the next tool of the toolbox, a history student must be familiar with the focus of their work in order to utilize the proper theories and methods appropriate for their given topic. Understanding and being able to identify history types and the fields associated with them can create a starting point for the student of history. The generally accepted types of history include intellectual, social, political, cultural, gender, post-colonial, world, and global history. Each type has specific theories and methods a historian utilizes to research, analyze, and create a credible argument. While it would be impractical to cover all the different fields of history, it is important to identify which type of history or histories a field falls under. Women's history as a field of study is a type of gender history, while military history would be considered a category of political history. LGBT history may fall under multiple types of history, i.e., gender, social, and cultural. It is the responsibility of the student of history to understand where a historian is coming from and the appropriate theories used in order to critique and properly analyze secondary sources. One of the most common forms of presenting one's work to the public, or in the student's case the professor, will be the historical narrative. The historical narrative is a creation of work based on a historian or student of history's interpretation of the evidence. As a student of history, one must choose a narrow topic and begin researching primary and secondary sources. After analyzing these sources and understanding the facts and evidence you have encountered, the student must create an original argument that can be supported by the evidence provided from your research. The narrative is meant to explain and interpret a subject or event and should always lead back to your argument of thesis. In discussing a historical narrative, a couple of important tools were mentioned. First, interpretation. Historical interpretation is the synthesis of a historian's research on a topic. In most cases, this is culminated in a historical narrative which is presented to others in a textual format. Historical interpretation is based on the research, reasoning, and analysis of primary and secondary sources to prove one's argument. Second, the argument and thesis. An argument defines where one stands on a subject. An example would be, Bayard Rustin was unfairly deprived of the recognition he deserved for his role in the civil rights movement. A thesis is the presentation of one's argument and a brief description on how proof will be provided to support the claim. Using the previous example, Bayard Rustin played an integral part in the civil rights movement as both Martin Luther King's advisor and the organizer of the March on Washington. It was his role in the Communist Party, his vocal opposition to Vietnam, his close personal ties to the Jewish community, and his homosexuality that deprived him of the recognition he deserved. It is important for the student of history to have a solid argument as the basis of their work. From there, they can form a well-developed thesis that will continually flow through their work all the way through to the conclusion. Lastly, sources. A student of history will be required to become comfortable identifying, analyzing, critiquing, and finding evidence for their argument utilizing both primary and secondary sources. A primary source, as defined by historian Robert Williams, is a document, image, or artifact that provides evidence about the past. It must be an original document created contemporaneously with the event or subject being researched. A secondary source is a book, article, or other format that otherwise displays primary sources to interpret the past. In most cases, this would be a book written by an historian or an expert on the particular subject being researched. When researching a topic or event, it is important to be as diverse as possible with one's sources. A diversity of perspectives will offer an historian a well-rounded interpretation for their narrative. As an example, an historian researching the effects of slavery on Africans brought over from Africa would certainly not limit themselves to the writings and works of white Southerners. In order to have a diversity of perspectives, one would need to include primary sources from both government archives and Black history museums, as well as secondary sources from a wide range of voices, including Black slaves, women, slave owners, free Black men, and perhaps Northerners and Europeans as well. One of the primary goals of an historian or student of history when researching an event will be to find causation. There are two different types of causation when it comes to historical research: necessary and sufficient. A necessary cause is a cause that had to happen if the caused event were ever to occur. This concept validates that a specific circumstance is required for an event or series of events to occur. As an example, the terrorist acts on 9/11/2001 were a necessary cause of the United States invasion of Afghanistan. A sufficient cause is a cause that led to the event only because the necessary causes were already present at the time. Historian Robert Williams' description explains secondary factors as they relate to the primary or necessary cause. Regarding the previous example, sufficient causation for the United States invasion of Afghanistan would be the Russian invasion of Afghanistan nearly 22 years earlier. An historian must analyze the evidence presented by primary and secondary sources to identify background causes, those that have operated over the long term and allowed the event to be part of the timeline. They must then identify direct causes, those that put the consequences of the event into existence. In effect, a historian must be able to identify, and through reasoning and analytic research, conclude the difference between necessary causation, or direct causes, and sufficient causation, or background causes. Lastly, locating, in the historical timeline, where these two planes of causation come together provide evidence needed to bring one back to their argument, and in some cases may actually invalidate their argument altogether. So far, a historian has identified their topic, researched a diverse set of primary and secondary sources, created a solid argument, and designed a well-organized thesis. Weaving through their narrative, they provided evidence-based interpretation, accurate depictions of a causation, and continually bring the writing back to their original argument and thesis. However, as a historian or student of history, the narrative work created will not be taken seriously without proper citations and footnotes. In order to be viewed as a true historian, and in the student's case, in order not to fail, it is imperative that one properly cite the sources of ideas, quotes, and themes that are not original thoughts to the author. In history, the most common form of citation is Chicago style, which is comprised of footnotes throughout the writing and a comprehensive list of sources in the works cited or bibliography section. As displayed, the portion in the quotes are the words of another author, and therefore must include a footnote directing the reader to the source. When creating a large historical narrative, one frequently used process can be vital to staying organized and ensuring no plagiarism occurs in the work. The annotated bibliography. In an annotated bibliography, the student lists, usually in alphabetical order, the properly formatted citation of a source followed by a brief description of its usefulness, arguments, themes, and perhaps methodologies and lenses through which the subject has been viewed. A recommendation that is useful: create an individual annotated bibliography for each source on separate index cards. On the back of each card, make notes and references that will help when citing this source throughout the narrative. As a student of history, it is imperative that the historian's toolbox be readily available as you navigate through your research and analysis of your chosen topic. While entire books have been written about each one of the tools covered in this video, it has provided an overview of some of the most important tools available to both the historian and student of history. In conclusion, as we place each tool back in its appropriate place inside the toolbox, a short review is provided to highlight what has been learned. Historiography, the study of how the history of a subject has been written about. History, types, and fields. Each have their own theories and methods used in the research and analysis of sources. The historical narrative. How the work of a historian is presented to the academic world or the general community. Interpretation. Through the historian's analysis of their sources, the interpretation is what is presented in the narrative. The argument. The student or historian's view on an event or subject. The thesis. The argument with a brief description of the evidence to be provided to support that view. Sources. Both primary and secondary sources will make up the large portion of evidence to support one's thesis. Through academic, scholarly, or expert secondary sources, the historian will choose to create a diversity of perspectives through their research and continually provide a path back to their original argument and thesis. Causation. Finding causation is one of the primary goals of researching and analyzing sources. Through understanding both necessary and sufficient causes and their interconnectedness, the historian is able to provide a clear understanding of the circumstances of an event and can tie them back to the argument in their thesis. Citations and footnotes. No written narrative or even this video can be considered an academic work without having proper citations and footnotes. They provide validity and credibility to the work in question and provide the reader or viewer the ability to research and analyze the sources used in the work, and to critique the interpretations or methods used in the reasoning. Lastly, it is important to give credit where credit is due. If it isn't your idea or thoughts, you have to lead the reader to where they came from. Otherwise, it's plagiarism. The historian's toolbox can be an integral tool for any student, but especially one of history. Through its tools, one can create an organized path through their research and follow in the footsteps of the many historians whose work we use every day. Through the tools provided today, a student can begin to overcome the challenges of the profession and begin to have some understanding of how to study history. The exploration of the historical process can be overwhelming, but armed with these tools, it can become not only less daunting, but fun. Inside the historian's toolbox, we have answered many of the questions history students face as they begin their journey to becoming an historian.